I'm very pleased to introduce Ethan Carr, who's an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning. He previously worked for the U.S. National Park Service and has authored several books, particularly on, I wanted to mention ones on historic park and road design in national parks. Ethan.
I think Nora had me go last because she knows I talk fast. So I will try to live up to that. Okay, I think we're all talking about the 20 years since the World Heritage Committee recognized cultural landscapes as eligible for the World Heritage List. And one thing that I think is recognizable that everyone has noticed is that the cultural landscape idea has proven to be resilient and successful in the sense that researchers and landscape managers have adapted, is that good, and developed the concept for a wide range of different contexts and purposes. I think the flexibility of the idea and its continued evolution has been its inherent strength. And so I'd like to speak briefly about one source of that flexibility and strength, and that is its the university partnerships with government agencies. Specifically, I'd like to speak about partnerships with the U.S. National Park Service, between universities and the U.S. National Park Service. Excuse me. Thank you. I have water. First, universities can offer opportunities for innovation and experimentation that don't always exist in government agencies and programs. Many of us here have worked in both settings and know that universities know that academia can be far more appropriate setting for questioning and stretching ideas and definitions for discussion and inquiry as part of research processes. Secondly, particularly in the last 20 years, academic partners have been adept at helping agencies engage groups and constituencies that might not have been engaged without such partnerships. This is true particularly for minority and youth communities, but really for many other groups as well, and for the entire more broadly construed subject of public engagement in cultural and historic site interpretation and for planning generally. Third, university partnerships are an integral part of policies to address the 2011 Heritage Committee strategy for capacity building and for protecting world cultural heritage for self-evident reasons. And finally, through field study courses and landscape architecture and planning studios in particular, university partnerships help implement new methods in cultural landscape research and suggest interpretive plans and designs that provoke fresh thinking and encourage re-examination of theory and methods. And such re-examination of theory and methods is almost always worthwhile, but rarely comes easily in established government agencies. Some of us know this also from personal experience. The slide here and the title of the talk is not intended to be necessarily as just a bit of internet humor, not intended to be a sense of the future direction referenced in the title. I would like to talk a little bit about the past, and we are referencing the past as well as the future in these presentations. Just briefly, this is a little bit of a different sense of the background and history of the past that we've been talking about so far this morning. In this case, it would be the past of the U.S. Park Service and university partnerships that I would be talking about. In the past, the U.S. Park Service and universities have engaged in partnerships that encouraged understandings and uses of U.S. national park landscapes as outdoor classrooms, so to speak. Park advocates recognized the public appeal of educational programs, and the scientific and research values of national parks elevated them above merely recreational purposes. And so from the beginning, they helped distinguish national parks from local and state parks, and this was very important in the early U.S. national park movement. We see here Ansel Hall, who began the education division of the Park Service, actually with offices in the University of California, Berkeley, in the 1920s, for example. In the 1930s, the Park Service education program expanded, and hired new academic scientists and historians, either in positions created for them within the agency or through other types of cooperative arrangements and partnerships. And this continued through the New Deal in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt, president at the time, transferred jurisdiction of dozens of battlefield memorial parks and other historic sites to the National Park Service, which now had a mandate to research and convey the significance of these cultural landscapes to the public. And so during the New Deal, the agency vastly expanded. It became more complicated, but it also had a mandate to manage cultural landscapes of vast new array of cultural landscapes which it didn't have before, and it also created new cultural landscapes in a sense, such as the Blue Ridge Parkway, which you see on the bottom right, which is really a 400-mile-long cultural landscape corridor which both preserved an Appalachian cultural landscape heritage and also effectively reimagined it in an era and redesigned it in an era of automotive tourism. And during this time, as the agency's history and education programs grew, the word education gradually was replaced by the word interpretation. It became the favored term, which I think is very telling. Interpretation, of course, is a word with a long history, but it implies this idea of a site-based orientation to a landscape's flora and fauna and human history, one that directly engaged visitors in the experience of a place, and one that is quite different from education in its emphasis. And it's this practice of interpreting sites and using them as outdoor classrooms, which required a multidisciplinary reading of a landscape, and so also perhaps can be considered a precursor of later concepts in Park Service cultural landscape management and research. An important early precursor, if you like, one that we don't normally associate with the early history of cultural landscape management, but one at the Park Service which goes back to the 1930s. After World War II, the National Park System received a large infusion of spending on infrastructure. Many of you know it as Mission 66, also an expansion of the park system. This was the era that gave us the visitor center, and that term, that word, that concept, that building type was invented by the Park Service at this time, and it also enshrined the technology and the word of interpretation during this time. And this was when, ironically, interpretation became something that moved to a significant degree indoors, and something also that became mediated to a significant degree, mostly because of the large numbers of visitors that needed to be dealt with. And so carousel slides and 16-millimeter movie projections became the precursors of today's videos and interactive displays. And so the outdoor classroom didn't disappear. It still existed, often as a large structured amphitheater, as it exists today, with a screen rather than a campfire at its center, or even more often as the roadside, which is really the most pervasive form of the outdoor classroom, perhaps today. Still. In any case, the continued ongoing educational mission for national parks has always maintained and encouraged university partnerships. And these partnerships, in turn, have also been instrumental in later and current developments in Park Service cultural landscape initiatives. There are many people here today, including, I noticed, Robert Melnick, who is a professor at the University of Oregon, really began the current era of university Park Service partnerships around 1980, I believe, and George Curry from SUNY ESF, and Stephanie Toothman, I believe, is here today, and Bob Page and Susan Dolan, all of whom, among others, will speak with knowledge and authority about later developments in, along the lines that the history I've been describing, and I certainly don't need to. What I'd like to talk about instead is some of the current and future ways that I see how cultural landscapes continue to serve as outdoor classrooms and as the loci of innovation and experimentation for the cultural landscape idea. The outdoor classroom, I would suggest, is alive and well, although I don't think it is in a visitor center, and perhaps not even in an amphitheater. It is the cultural landscape itself. This is an interesting example. I think the Hudson River School Art Trail, recently put in place by the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, which puts its visitors into the Catskills landscape in the Hudson River Valley and challenges them to engage it in ways that convey its heritage and significance in ways that only being there possibly can. The central observation I would like to make this morning is that it seems increasingly true that the conditions that encourage successful cultural landscape management converge with those that stimulate productive educational experience. Successful cultural landscape management may now involve economists, climate scientists, food system experts, and may require the full engagement of farmers, foresters, local business people, as well as the people working for those farmers and businesses. The reality of the cultural landscape today is multidisciplinary and reaches beyond the traditional partnership of university and agency to include a broad engagement of the people who live and work in the landscape. Where this new sense and type of partnership is occurring, so are some of the most successful examples of cultural landscape management in the U.S. National Park System. And again, there are many individuals here today, including our panel moderator who can speak with knowledge in this regard. Roxbury Farm, for example, is a privately owned farm operated on a CSA business model employing biodynamic principles within the boundaries of Martin Van Buren National Historic Site in New York. And both the Park Service and its university partners offering curricula or doing research in the field of cultural landscapes have a tremendous stake in appreciating how the history of partnerships has fostered a flexible and varied approach to cultural landscape studies, education, and management. University partnerships continue to create opportunities to enhance stewardship, create new means of interpretation, and provide opportunities for multidisciplinary education and research. The Designing the Parks initiative that I've been involved with for over 4 years with Sean Eyring and others at the Park Service has many aspects to it, one of which is research in cultural landscape history and stewardship. One aspect notably is a design competition, which was recently completed, and that specifically involved design schools, which were selected in a first phase of the competition. And so the competition was a design studio competition, an educational experience for the students, and hopefully for the Park Service as well, engaging a whole generation of young professionals in the fields involved. And the sites chosen for the competition included major cultural landscape sites within the National Park System, including Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site and Nicodemus National Historic Site, the Civil War defenses of Washington, D.C., San Juan Island National Historic Park in Washington State, et cetera. But other parks in the competition, including Biscayne National Historic Site, National Historic Park in Miami, and so on, also received what I would describe as cultural landscape research analysis. And that's because what we might call cultural landscape research or inventory and documentation is really integral to landscape architectural design, even in areas of significant natural resource values in the best landscape planning and design processes today. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the winners of this design competition, because one was City College of New York for their remarkable project at the Nicodemus National Historic Site in Kansas, and the other was the Rutgers Landscape Architecture Department here at Rutgers University, led by Kate John Alder in the Landscape Architecture Department for their Hopewell Furnace National Historic work at Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site in Pennsylvania. Congratulations to Kate John Alder, who I believe is here today. And at the University of Massachusetts, at the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning, Elizabeth Brabeck recently brought me and Flavia Montenegro Menezes to join her and form a new cultural landscape initiative to be associated with the new Center for Heritage and Society at the university. And we've begun by inaugurating this year a certificate program in cultural landscape management, a certificate that can be attached to a master's degree at the university, and which I believe is the first of its type at an American university. In my case, this is the continuation of a culmination of work that's been going on for some time at the University of Massachusetts, at the Cape Cod National Seashore, for example. Bob Page and the Olmsted Center for Landscape Preservation some time ago asked us to do form a multidisciplinary group at UMass and engage in a new approach, which we called a landscape character study, to engage in intensive public engagement and dialogue, as well as the use of GIS and more traditional cultural landscape documentation and analysis, to put together what became an account and documentation of the historic and current activities and values integrated into the documentation of the physical features of the landscape, even those as natural, so to speak, and as iconic as the Great Beach itself. These combined accounts of activities and values and physical features and characteristics were described as headings, and this combined methodology resulted in an illustrated ethnography of a series of component quickly to the end. Illustrated ethnography of a series of component landscapes that were themselves identified through facilitated public meetings led by historian David Glassberg. I would like to get to the end because I think we need to. Is that correct, Nora? Nora, did you advance my slides to the end? And in any case, the project looks like this when it's published. You didn't advance them on purpose, right? No, that was this is not going well. Currently in another project, encouraged by the Olmsted Center in collaboration with the Martin Van Buren National Historic Site, we're also working with the park to consider the full implications of the 2009 boundary expansion that increased the size of the park from under 40 acres, that was just the house itself and the immediate grounds, to about 300 acres, including most of the historic farm that President Van Buren owned and farmed in the mid-19th century. This is a project, again, involving a range of partners and disciplines, including an ethnographic history of the agriculture of the region by Kathy Stanton, working with the UMass History Department, as well as landscape architecture studios, looking at how visitors arrive and are oriented and experience this new kind of national park, most of which will remain under private ownership, which was the Roxbury Farm we were just looking at a moment ago. Most of the agricultural context remains largely intact in this part of the Hudson Valley. And this factor was of interest to the students. This is some student work who are fascinated by the potentially new juxtapositions of public visitors and ongoing farming, which may be a source of interest, perhaps not entirely resolved, but nevertheless certainly of interest. And these kinds of juxtapositions were important for the park and students to consider. Other students looked here at more traditional graphic representation, perhaps, of a more traditional exercise in cultural landscape rehabilitation and management, as well as a more traditional exercise in resolving the complex circulation schematic diagrams of all the different types of circulation that this new boundary expansion involves, as well as looking at more detailed solutions, again, for the trail systems that will be the heart of this new type of national park. So, now I can't get to my last slide. Thank you. That's the last one. So to finish, I've been talking about University National Park Service partnerships in the United States, but I'm aware during the last 20 years there have been parallel significant developments internationally, and that our efforts are and should be increasingly integrated into these, notably the UNESCO University and and Heritage Forum and international seminars that I began, I think, in 1996, and which provide important international network for us, and I think we should be more involved in it. And this is just one indication of the increasingly international context in general for all of our work, regardless of our institutional homes, and an example of the kind of network we need to be part of and also to emulate in the US, and I hope we can begin that here. I see lots of my colleagues here. We need to emulate this kind of network here in North America, as well as being more involved in it itself. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ethan, very much for that and for the suggestion of certainly one step forward.